5 pages. But please allow me to briefly summarize some specific aspects of our main conclusions. We found that yesterday's election were competitive and professionally managed, with active voter participation. However, the noted efforts to undermine voters' trusts in the electoral process by baselessly questioning its integrity can result in systematic changes. Campaigning was free but highly polarized and marred by harsh rhetoric. In many cases, partisan redistricting resulted in uncompetitive constituency. Also, disclosure mechanisms for campaign finances are generally comprehensive, but loopholes in the regulatory framework make the impact of money in politics less transparent. Money in the diverse media landscape made effort to present accurate information, but polarization and widespread disinformation affected voters' ability to inform themselves. Election administrators enjoyed general confidence, but the politicization of the office of chief election officials and the intimidation of election workers are of concern. Restrictions on international observers in some states are at odds with the OSCE commitments. As mentioned, the campaign was highly competitive, with discussion of the economy and inflation, as well as abortion rights, prominent across the country. So while substantive, we noted that the campaigns by both major parties were intensively divisive and used inflammatory rhetoric. And the vocal refusal by some to accept the legitimacy of the 2020 result had a harmful effect on public discourse and decreased confidence in the system. I would also like to return to a topic that we have repeatedly raised in the past and have previously recommended to address. Citizens living in the District of Columbia and US territories lack full voting rights, and restrictions remain on the voting rights on convicted criminals and persons with intellectual disabilities. These are contrary to commitments that the United States has undertaken within the OSCE. Overall, however, the American people once again demonstrated their commitment to democratic elections in a hard-fought campaign and professionally run process. Unfortunately, we also noted that baseless allegation of fraud continue to have a serious result with harassment and threats to election officials. Certain systematic challenges, such as gerrymandering, enabling politicians to choose their voters rather than the opposite, and the outsized influence of money on campaigning, must be addressed to ensure the equality of the vote. I leave it to my colleagues here to also add any additional conclusions that they would like to raise. As mentioned, at the moment, we are only giving a short snapshot of the main assessment, and the full statement will soon be made available to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sederveld. And now, please, Mr. Pons.
Thank you. And first of all, and in the name of the whole delegation and mission, I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the US authorities for having invited us to observe these midterm elections. It is already our 9th observation mission in the United States, And as the head of delegation, I was really pleased to lead the biggest observation mission in the history of the Parliamentary Assembly. I think this is extremely important. Based on our observations themes, I would like to underline the following. First, we have observed in a country with a solid and robust democracy. Second, the country is facing challenges such as inflation and energy crisis, as many other countries, like mine, for example. These challenges our societies, our daily lives, and of course, our democracies. However, these midterm elections show the strength of how well the country can tackle the global challenges, as well as mirror the state of the world democracy. It is crucial that the United States, as a robust and well-established democracy, continues to demonstrate its commitment to improving its electoral system by increasing the franchise, enhancing election security, and countering misinformation. The entire world has been watching these elections, as the importance is going beyond the US borders. And let me underline that I was really impressed by the professionalism of the poll workers who made the running of election as smooth as for the voters as possible. We were also impressed by the voters' active engagement. Yesterday was not just an election, but the last day of voting in many states. High turnout, it is a clear indication of how important the election for the lives of citizens, as well as for the country's future. Despite the variety of the races, I would like to stress that women representation remains low. It is not unique. However, balanced representation in decision-making bodies constitute an important element of the democratic process.
Recording in progress.
And let me end with one main idea. The challenges of democracy that the US faces are common to many OSCE countries, and we must all work together to ensure that the citizens have trust in their democratic processes. Even in a sensitive, polarized context, voting is a key tool to tackle its challenges and contribute to the strengthening to the overall state of democracy in the world. So I hope this observation can become a lesson learned, and our conclusions will resonate in the mind of voters, politicians, as well as international institutions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pons. And now please, Ms. Zulueta.
Good afternoon, and many thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this. Like my colleagues, we are particularly grateful as members of the ODIHR mission for the invitation, but also the assistance of the United States authorities, the State Department in particular, but also the members of the election administration who right across the country in different states took some of their precious time to enable us to report on these elections. As it was mentioned, on election day, we had an unprecedented number of parliamentarians observing the process yesterday. But our part of the mission arrived in the country at the end of September. We opened our office in Washington, D.C. on the 27th. We were joined by 40 long-term observers from different participating OSCE states. And on the 4th of October, they were deployed across the country and have been reporting back to us ever since. Like us, and they are still there following the count. And like us, they will remain in the country after the election to look at the ongoing litigation. And we will not be here for the probable announcement of all the final results, but we will be better placed to assess in our final report, which will be published probably 2 months from now, the overall picture which these elections present. Our mandate was to assess the conduct of these elections for their compliance with what are called OSCE commitments. And these commitments are summed up in a political document, which the United States was party, in fact, a very active party in its drafting. And we also try and assess for whether it's compliance with international commitments to which the United States is party, and above all, local national legislation. Now, that, of course, is a challenging task because we're talking about 50 different states administering their elections. And these states have passed close to, perhaps, yes, more than 400 amendments and new rules and regulations since the last elections. Are we attempted to assess the impact of these changes on the elections themselves? The fact they were challenges in the courts is another thing that we had to follow through, because the courts' decisions shape the legislation, the rules. There is a strong principle in the United States, the so-called Purcell principle, which advises that court decisions should not be taken close to elections, but the process is such that in some cases we had the impact felt right up to voting day, with cases on redistricting still open, leading to uncertainty for both the candidates and the administration. As Madam Sederfeld pointed out, we tried to take a good look at redistricting because of the 2020 census and the reapportionment of a number of seats in the House. So, and on that issue, yes, our findings were that some, what is, partisan redistricting did impact the elections, and it does not guarantee the representativeness that both national and international standards would indicate. We looked at the campaign environment while we were here, and yes, in some ways, it was quite a tense build-up to yesterday, which is one of the reasons why I think, like citizens, we appreciated the very professional way in which, in the number of polling stations we were able to observe, which the state size of this country was limited, it was extremely professionally administered with a very, very supportive system of assistance for voters. And the fact there were no serious incidents was one of great satisfaction for all. But the threats did accompany the campaign and indeed preceded it, threats against the election administration itself, of which we also had reported cases to our observers, and against the candidates. All this concern was enhanced following the attack on the husband of the Speaker of the House. It has to be said that much of the fury vented on social media, which, like mainstream media, we have attempted to observe and assess, and indeed we monitor the media. Much of the fury and distrust in the election process, which fueled the aggressiveness in some cases, and indeed the attack on Mr. Pelosi, spring from the events following the last presidential election and the baseless claims that it was rigged. Trust in a system is one of the aspects of an election we try to assess, and it's particularly important in such a large country with such a complex system, and has traditionally been an important component. Given the central role of machines in the US election process, trust here, once again, was one of the issues we tried to look at, and the measures that were taken to reinforce it. In that respect, our interlocutors were, on the whole, confident, and the issue did not come up in the same way, at least in the earlier phases of campaigning, that it had in the past. So here we have strong federal and local initiatives to ensure the security of the system. Campaign finance, always of key importance in any election, and particularly in a contest in which the strength of candidates is measured by their ability to raise and spend money, is an aspect of the election we looked at closely. We thank those who found time to brief us, both at the Federal Election Commission and across the country. The disclosure of incomes and expenditures by candidates and parties and committees provides reasonable transparency of their funding, we found, but it is undermined by the lack of disclosure by tax-exempted organizations involved in the campaign, raising concerns over the undue influence of interest groups over candidates and obscuring voters' awareness of the influence such interest groups may have. Furthermore, the legally required separation between campaigns and independent committees, the non-coordination, is apparently quite easily circumvented and has limited effect. The Federal Election Commission's enforcement capability is frequently affected by the inability to muster the votes required to make a decision, and by the prosecutorial discretion to dismiss administrative complaints, leaving such complainants without legal recourse. And last but anything but least, the media. As I mentioned, we did monitor media, and as we always do, but now we add to that the very substantial challenge of assessing the impact of social media. So we did quantitative and qualitative analysis of election-related coverage on 7 TV networks and cable news channels, as well as public service radio, along with 2 national newspapers and 4 online websites. I have to say that a vibrant, pluralistic media environment like that which we have observed, indeed enjoyed here, is in itself a prerequisite for competitive elections like those we've seen. But when the content and character of the coverage and commentary consists of derogatory and often offensive language towards those involved in the process, whether they be political opponents, election officials, and even in some cases voters, it does create an atmosphere that, as we observed, can lead to threats and intimidation and indeed violence, while doing no service to citizens rightly seeking objective and factual information. So thank you very much once again. Naturally, we're ready to take the questions of those who are here today and in the room, but also those who have kindly been watching us online in the media.
Okay, thank you, Tana. First of all, I'm going to open up the floor. If you do have a question, I'll ask you to raise your hand. Yes, and a microphone will be brought to you. Before you ask your question, please, if you could provide your name and the media outlet that you're representing. Sorry, the mic's just coming this way now. Now it's coming fast. Yeah. No, this way.
Hi there, Chris Cameron, New York Times. You mentioned in your summary of the election environment, the importance of voting machines. I wanted to ask if there was any observation or insight into the issues with election voting machines in Arizona, for example, the misprinting issue and the litigation that was brought by the Republican Party in Arizona to sort of allow for continued voting, the extension of voting hours in response to that problem. And then also what was mentioned in the summary was the baseless allegations of fraud in the 2022 election. If you could provide any details or specifics or specific candidates who may have raised this issue that you'd be willing to discuss. Thank you.
No one? First, who would
you like?
whoever would like to speak? Something to say on first. I think handle the questions two at a time. So the first, one at a time. Sorry. So first on the Arizona question.
I can say a few words.
On the Arizona question.
Not on the Arizona, but overall. But please give the floor to Tana.
Okay,
More
sure.
about Arizona.
Please.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Absolutely, yes.
We have our observer team is actually in Phoenix, so we were in Maricopa County yesterday. We know what you know, and prior to the election, we had no signal from the election administration, and obviously it caught them by surprise, as it did us. We will follow up the litigation in the days to come.
Okay, and the second question, I believe, with regard to the election denial in 2020 and which 2022.
No, I referred to it in 2020, but you asked whether we've seen it in 2022. That's right.
Oh, sorry.
Margareta, did you want to say
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would say that what we have heard and what we have seen so far, will we also follow up to have really confirmation on what we have seen. We didn't have any observers from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, any short-term observers in Arizona, but there have been long-term observers, so they will follow up on this issue. But what I also would like to mention here is that it's of course very important, and I really appreciate that the US federal government have invited us to observe the election. And I think that this also, it's demonstrated that there is a willingness to be transparent about the process and democracy, and it shows also that it's not only this election, it's all over the year, because we have been invited for all elections since it's ninth election we observe here, and this is very, very important, of course. And I think this shows the openness and transparency and willingness to also have international observers in place in the country. But this is also, it means that we have to be responsible for what we say, and that's related to what I mentioned with we need to also investigate and have facts when we speak out, and also to dig a little bit deeper in some questions. Thank you.
But regarding the candidates, yes, during the campaign we observed. I can't out of the top of my head remember, but in the rallies which we observed candidates declaring the fact that they believe that the presidential election in 2020 was rigged. And we then also refer to the findings of media that which proportion of candidates to the House, but we actually observed instances, and some of these people have appeared to have been elected. So we were looking at both the candidates to Congress and candidates to the offices of state, Secretary of State and Governor. Mm-hmm. So those were the candidates we observed fell in those three categories. Mm. The numbers, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're there in the statement. So we can fish them out for you and you'll see them in a few minutes.
Okay, I'll come up then. We have a question coming from the Zoom feed here, and this has been submitted by Jennifer Hansler from CNN. She said there was mention of restrictions on observers in some states. Which states and what were the restrictions?
Yes, I could say,
please.
Thank you. I could say in some, the legislation for how to perform an election here in US is very much up to the different states, to the independent states to decide about. And this gives us restriction in some way where we are allowed to be let in the polling station and where we can go in. And we have focused to observe, of course, and to send observers to those states where we are let in the polling stations. So we don't have to stand outside. And I haven't all the states in my head. It's in the paper booklet that you will receive later, but there are maybe 15. Yeah, it's 15 states who don't let us in the polling stations. But in those states who let us observe, we have been well received and we have also been welcomed and welcome to observe without any restrictions.
They fall into three categories: those which explicitly allow for, those which explicitly do not allow, and those which do not actually clarify the status of international observers. And even there, sometimes the interpretation of this legal silence, as it were, is interpreted differently by different counties. We were very attentive to observe the law as it stands in every part of the country we observed. But, and in some places we could observe and indeed talk to election administrations freely before and see the premises, but couldn't go back on election day. In one state, we can observe tabulation, but not because it's public. Everything that's public one can observe, but not the count because it's not public. And so on. So we simply point to the issue behind this, which is that the United States invites international observer missions, but not all the states allow for it. And so we note it every time. Look forward to when it doesn't, when they're allowed everywhere.
I would also like to add one thing. I think if I compare to when I was observer first time in the United States, we were not allowed to visit different polling stations. We were going around in a group. These days, we are welcome to observe like we do in those states that allow us in, as in all other countries where we can move around and ask our questions. Of course, without interference, but that's not what we are here to do. And so I see quite a lot of improvement about also to welcoming observers. And as I see it, also seeing that we contribute to give recommendations how to improve the election systems, and that by this also improve the impact of voters.
Yeah, I would like to add one point on this. during the last 24 hours, last 12 hours, we have compiled all the feedback from the more than 130 observers that were observing on the D-Day and the stage in which we were allowed. And the first feedback is that it was very positive, very good observation, no incidents, extremely very good circuit of information, no tension, and little incidents, non-incidents actually. So this is a qualitative information, very, let's say, hot information after 12 hours, after 12 hours during the last night compiling, but I think it's quite successful, at least for, at least at the first view. So thank you.
All right, and one last question then for which time's out. Well, this question is actually from FM 98.7 in South Africa. And for Ms. Zulueta, to what extent was this election free, fair, and credible? And what elements did you take into consideration on making this judgment?
If I should say what important for us, it's of course the Copenhagen document from 1990, which the United States government has committed to adhere to. And it's saying to ensure that voters are cast by secret ballot and by equivalent free voting procedures, and that they are content and reported honestly, with the officials' results made public. And the United States government has committed to do this, and all the three branches of the government should work to ensure this commitment is upheld. And this is the commitment that US have undertaken, and this is also what we follow up. And we do it in different ways, but I think this commitment is important, and that's also what we refer to, and could see that it's a free election, and the secrecy is also respected.
Of course, we're talking about an ongoing process because the elections are not entirely over, and that as we entered this room, not all the races were decided that we were observing. But yes, and that is why we report on the state of things as they stand. And as my colleagues have pointed out, the reports we have report of an election in line. The issues, the manner in which we observe and assess, I think I tried to summarize in my presentation, so I won't go back on that. But yes, that's the language we use is the best description of our assessment. These were competitive elections and professionally managed with active and voter participation. We do have long-standing recommendations because that's what the final reports of ODIHR do, add to what we've said today. And some of these long-standing recommendations, as we mentioned before, have not been addressed. Perhaps the disenfranchisement in the sense that the citizens of the District of Columbia have no congressional representation is an issue we pointed to again in almost all our reports. And I think this is the 10th it will be. And the other one is the exclusion of former felons with the restrictions on their rights, and which is not in line with international standards, and also those of persons declared mentally incapacitated by the courts. So those are an example of a long-standing recommendation we will go back to. There was legislation tabled in former past legislature which did address important ODIHR recommendations. It passed in the House, did not in the Senate. We shall see what happens in this legislature and look forward to discussing it with stakeholders and Congress itself.
Well, all right then, thank you. And thank you all for attending. I think this brings our press conference to an end. With nothing more to say than to wish you all a wonderful rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.